So Sony sent me a rather large package today, and I think I have a hunch as to what it is. This is the new Sony A8F, which is Sony's new flagship 4K HDR OLED TV that is actually the successor to the A1E that we saw last year that was pretty highly praised. It's also the one that kind of pioneered their new Acoustic Surface technology, which we'll talk about more in a sec. Now, to call it a successor to the A1E is technically true, but actually a lot of the underlying tech and the performance has actually remained the same. There are two big changes, however, that make it a lot better for a lot of people, I think. But first, let's start with the similarities. The TV has a 4K resolution and supports HDR content. If you're not familiar, HDR is high dynamic range, and it means more shades of color, deeper blacks and brighter whites, as well as more colors to display. Think of it as the color upgrade or the contrast upgrade to content, where 4K was sort of the resolution upgrade to content. Another cool thing is that it even supports upscaling to 4K HDR thanks to the X1 Extreme Sony processor, which is the same from the A1E, by the way, that is a serious powerhouse. Now this means that even your non-4K, non-HDR content supposedly can get upgraded to 4K and even HDR using a system in here that actually will analyze each frame of every video that you watch and even be able to determine different objects within the frame based on some databases that Sony has to be able to determine whether this object needs to be brightened or darkened or change the color of, and this one as well, and the background versus the foreground and all this other fun stuff. Now, just to show you some differences, here's two 4K TVs, both playing the same content from Netflix that's HDR capable, and you can kind of see the difference in the details and the color. The blacks are super dark to me, as they probably should be an OLED TV, but the TV isn't the brightest on the market at just 700 nits. Now, for me, I had no problem with the brightness at all, but maybe if you had windows behind you while you were trying to watch the TV, or it was just super bright, you might experience something, but again, no issues for me in my setup. So the other piece of tech that I'm personally a little infatuated with this screen is the Acoustic Surface tech. So the TV has actuators behind the OLED panel that actually vibrate the panel itself, turning into it a giant speaker. And there's two kind of distinct spots where sound comes from on the TV, and it can actually use software to kind of determine what's on the screen and then move the sound across it or from a different location on the screen, so you kind of get this like feeling that whatever is making the sound on the screen is actually where the sound is coming from. For example, when this lizard runs across the screen, it definitely moves the sound from the right to the left. Now, of course, I tried really hard to see if the screen would actually make any noticeable vibrations just to check, but since it is only used for the high end and mid-tones, it's vibrating so fast that you can't really see it move. Moving around the TV, let's talk about the ports. The TV has 3 USB ports and 4 HDMI ports that all support HDMI 2.0 and HDCP 2.2. But it's worth noting that only the HDMI inputs 2 and 3 supposedly support 4K at 60 frames per second. So basically that's where you're going to want to plug in your Xbox or your PlayStation. We also have a remote port, a digital audio out optical port, a LAN port so you can plug Ethernet directly into the TV, our normal cable antenna connection that's coaxial, and we also have our remote IR in port if you need to set up the IR receiver somewhere further away, as well as an IR blaster port for actually sending signals back out of the TV to control other devices. Now the TV is running Android TV, which I agree with most people is not the most intuitive OS for a television, but I don't actually really mind it, and sometimes I actually kind of like it. But one of the other things that I've noticed with the TV, and with Android TV in particular, is that sometimes there can be a noticeable amount of lag. And we're talking like pushing the settings button and getting a few seconds before it actually comes up. Which, right, not the end of the world, but it is kind of annoying and something you don't really expect from such a premium product. Now, Sony did mention that there will be an update soon that will completely change the UI and make it a lot better. So we'll see what that's like when it eventually does come out. Now, one thing I do like about Android TV though is the integration with Google Assistant and Chromecast. The setup process, which is super fast and easy, and the fact that you can use your Amazon Alexa or Google Home to turn it on, change channels, and just generally control the TV however you want. Now, for something that has actually changed for this TV from the A1E is that it's no longer held up by a giant leg in the back. This easel-looking configuration was unique in my opinion, but the new, more standard-looking mount means a much smaller footprint needed for putting it on the media console and makes it sit much more flush against the wall when mounted up. So while it might be less cool, it's probably a lot more functional for most people. Also, in the base, we have covers and channels to route your cables so that they're not all over the place, which is good for that minimalistic look, of course. Now, the remote is a big complaint from a lot of people because, well, it's the same remote that you get with their lower-end TVs. And next to some of the much more refined ones from Samsung and LG, it definitely looks old. It does have a crap ton of buttons though, a nice soft touch to it, and has the ability to use the IR blasting so you can program it to your other devices like your cable box, speaker system, etc. Now, on the remote, we do have a specific button for our Google Assistant that you can also tap to then talk to the Google Assistant and have it change things like I mentioned before from, your living room lights to whatever else you have set up with your Google Home. Just under the number pad, we actually have buttons for Google Play, which is the App Store, as well as Netflix, and 4 programmable buttons with different colors that you can change. Beneath that, we have our action menu, which is kind of like a settings button that comes up, the guide, a list of all of our apps, home, back, a shortcut to the TV, which is our whatever's coming through that coaxial in the back, and then also a D-pad that allows us to navigate and push in the center to select things. Bottom, we have our normal volume, channels, muting, audio, playback, previous, next, subtitles, and all that other fun stuff. Now, another thing you can also do, by the way, because it is an Android TV, is use the Android TV app, which has its own controller in. Even though it is quite basic, you can basically turn any phone or tablet that you have, whether it's iOS or Android, into a remote as well. Now, finally, the last major change, and it is a major one, is that the A8F is about $1,000 cheaper than last year's model for the 55-inch and $1,500 cheaper for the 65-inch, which is what we have here.